Open on black, the sound of wind, then waves, enormous waves crashing against ancient rock. The audio builds slowly, layered with the distant cry of seabirds. Slow fade into a grey, rain-soaked coastline. An aerial drone shot begins pulling back to reveal a small cluster of stone cottages huddled against a cliff face. The village is completely silent. No smoke rises from any chimney. No light flickers in any window. The doors hang open. The gardens have gone entirely to ruin. It is the morning of August 29th, 1930, and on this island, one of the most isolated places on the entire planet, something extraordinary is about to happen. Cut to a black and white archival photograph, we see a small wooden boat bobbing in grey water. 36 people stand along a harbour wall, staring back at the shore behind them. Some are weeping. Others have turned their faces away entirely. They are not refugees. They are not prisoners. They are not fleeing war or famine. They are leaving voluntarily, and they are never coming back. This is St Kilda, an archipelago of islands in the North Atlantic Ocean, 40 miles west of Scotland's Outer Hebrides. For thousands of years, a community lived here, completely cut off from the rest of the world. They built their own laws. They raised their own children. They survived storms that would destroy most ships. But by 1930, their world had collapsed from within. Cut to a slow pan across the abandoned village street. Grass has already begun swallowing the doorways. The church roof sags under the weight of years. The school where children once learned to read now holds nothing but silence and the bleating of stray sheep. The evacuation of St Kilda is one of the most famous disappearances in British history. Nearly every history book mentions it. Nearly every documentary stops at the same point, the moment the last boat left the harbour. But here is what almost nobody tells you. What happened to St Kilda after everyone left? What became of the cottages, the church, the graves, the animals? Did the island simply fade into obscurity and silence? Or did something far stranger unfold across the decades that followed? The people vanished, but the story was only just beginning. To understand what happened after 1930, you first need to understand what St Kilda actually was. St Kilda is not one island. It is an archipelago, a small chain of islands and rock stacks jutting out of the North Atlantic like the broken fingers of an ancient giant. The main island, called Hirta, is where the village stood. Beside it rises Soe, a steep and grassy isle where sheep have roamed for centuries. And then there are the stacks, enormous columns of volcanic rock rising straight out of the sea, some of them over 1,000 feet tall. In rare archival footage, we can see these towers of stone disappearing into low cloud, completely dwarfing the tiny boats that once sailed beneath them. At its peak, the St Kilda population reached somewhere around 1,800 people. This was a community that had existed in near total isolation for generations. There was no road connecting them to the mainland. There was no regular ferry. For months at a time, particularly during winter, no boat could safely reach the island at all. The people of St Kilda developed their own dialect, their own customs, and their own extraordinary method of harvesting seabirds from the cliff faces, climbing sheer rock walls hundreds of feet above the ocean, using nothing but horsehair ropes. But isolation is a double-edged weapon. By the early 1900s, the population had begun to shrink steadily. Young people left for the mainland and never returned. The outside world was becoming louder, brighter, more connected, and St Kilda offered none of it. A radio arrived on the island in 1912, and for the first time, the islanders could hear voices from Edinburgh and London crackling through the static. It was a window into a world they had never seen, and for many of the younger generation, it made the idea of staying on a rock in the middle of the Atlantic feel less like home and more like a cage. Diseases swept through the community with devastating speed because the islanders had no immunity to common illnesses from the outside world. In 1918, a flu pandemic killed 4 people in a population that had already dwindled to fewer than 100. By the summer of 1930, only 36 people remained, and on August the 29th of that year, every single one of them signed a petition requesting formal evacuation by the British government. The Royal Navy sent the HMS Harebell. The islanders packed what little they could carry. They walked down to the harbour for the last time, and St Kilda became empty. The first thing that struck anyone who returned to St Kilda in the months following the evacuation was the silence. In rare photographs from 1931 and 1932, we can see the village street of Hirta looking almost exactly as it did on the day the last family left. Doors still closed, personal belongings still sitting on tables inside the cottages, a thin layer of dust settling over everything like ash after a fire. The British government had arranged for the evacuation to be as orderly as possible. The islanders were not rushing. They were not panicking. They were simply closing a chapter that had lasted centuries. A few of the cottages had their doors locked from the outside. Others were left wide open, as though their owners had simply stepped out for the afternoon and intended to return before dark. The village did not look abandoned. It looked paused, and that in many ways made it more unsettling than if it had been torn apart. The ownership of the islands passed quickly to private hands. The Marquis of Bute, a wealthy Scottish nobleman, acquired St Kilda shortly after the evacuation. His intention was to preserve the archipelago as a sanctuary for wildlife. The seabird colonies that had sustained the islanders for generations, the puffins, the fulmars, the gannets, were left entirely undisturbed. Within just a few years, the bird populations began to recover in dramatic fashion. Imagine walking through the village street of Hirta in 1935. The cottages still stand, their stone walls weathered but mostly intact. But the silence is no longer complete. Thousands of birds are nesting in the cracks of the walls, in the abandoned church, in the gutters where rain once flowed. Nature is not waiting for permission. It is simply moving back in. The sheep, however, tell a more remarkable story. When the islanders left Hirta, they deliberately released a small flock of sheep onto the neighbouring island of Soay. These were not ordinary farm sheep. They were an ancient breed, primitive, hardy, and almost entirely self-sufficient. The islanders had raised them for wool and meat for generations, but on the day of evacuation, there was simply no way to transport them to the mainland. So the sheep stayed, and they thrived. In photographs from the late 1930s, we can see them roaming freely across Soay's hillsides, completely wild, completely unmanaged, surviving the brutal Atlantic winters entirely on their own. Then the Second World War arrived, and St Kilda, already forgotten by most of Britain, found itself drawn back into the story of history in ways nobody anticipated. St Kilda's involvement in warfare actually predates the Second World War. During the First World War, in 1918, a German U-boat surfaced near the archipelago and opened fire on the village of Hirta. The bombardment caused significant damage to several cottages and destroyed the church bell tower. At the time, there were still islanders living there, and the attack sent shockwaves through the small community. It was one of the reasons the population accelerated its decline in the years that followed. The memory of artillery fire echoing off those ancient cliffs stayed with the St Kilda survivors long after they relocated to the Scottish mainland. By the time the Second World War began in 1939, the islands had been empty for nearly a decade, but their strategic position in the North Atlantic made them a point of interest for both sides. German U-boats operated extensively in these waters, hunting British convoys carrying supplies from North America. St Kilda sat directly in the path of these shipping lanes. In rare intelligence reports from the era, researchers have found references to German submarines using the archipelago as a navigational waypoint, a lonely, uninhabited cluster of rocks that appeared on no regular patrol route and attracted no British naval attention. Whether German sailors ever set foot on the islands remains a matter of debate among historians, but the possibility has never been fully ruled out. On the British side, the Royal Navy occasionally sent vessels to check on the archipelago during the war years. In one documented visit from 1942, a naval survey team found the village of Hirta in a state of gradual but unmistakable decay. The roofs of several cottages had begun to collapse under the weight of accumulated rain and wind damage. The church, already weakened by the 1918 bombardment, was sagging visibly. But the stone walls, built by generations of islanders using techniques passed down through centuries, were still standing. They would continue to stand for decades to come. The war ended in 1945, and St Kilda received almost no attention from the outside world. Britain was exhausted, rebuilding, and focused entirely inward. The archipelago sat forgotten in the North Atlantic, known to almost nobody outside of a handful of ornithologists and the scattered descendants of the original islanders now living on the Scottish mainland. For years, no official record was kept of what was happening on the islands. No government department monitored the decay of the village or the expansion of the bird colonies. St Kilda simply existed, unobserved, in one of the emptiest stretches of ocean on the planet. It was as though the archipelago had been quietly erased from the map of British life, present in geography but absent from memory. But something quiet and significant was happening on those islands. The Marquis of Bute, who had held ownership since the 1930s, began working with early conservation organisations to establish St Kilda as a protected nature reserve. In 1957, ownership was transferred to the National Trust for Scotland. This was not simply an administrative decision. It was one of the first major steps in the history of British conservation, a formal acknowledgement that these islands and their ecosystems deserved to be preserved, not for human use, but for the natural world that had reclaimed them. The seabird colonies exploded in size. By the 1960s and 1970s, St Kilda was home to one of the largest and most important seabird populations in the entire Northern Hemisphere. The gannet colony on the neighbouring stack of Borarray, one of those enormous towers of rock rising straight out of the sea, became one of the largest in the world. In stunning aerial footage shot by visiting researchers during this period, we can see the rock faces completely white with nesting birds, so densely packed that the stone beneath them is invisible. This was what St Kilda looked like when no human hand touched it, and it was magnificent. The village itself continued its slow transformation. Imagine standing in the street of Hirta in 1965. The cottages are still there, most of them, but their roofs are gone entirely now, open to the sky like stone boxes. Rain pools on the floors where families once sat by peat fires. The church stands as a hollow shell, its walls still upright, but everything inside stripped away by decades of wind and moisture. The school is the same. The storehouse where the islanders kept dried fish and wool is collapsing inward on itself. And everywhere there is grass, thick, wild, Atlantic grass pushing up through the flagstones and into every crack and corner. The village is not being destroyed, it is being absorbed. Not everyone had simply walked away from St Kilda and forgotten it forever. Among the descendants of the original islanders, the memory of the archipelago burned with quiet intensity for generations. Some of these families traced their roots on Hirta back hundreds of years. The evacuation of 1930 was not ancient history to them. It was something their grandparents lived through, something their parents talked about at the dinner table. In the decades following the war, small groups of descendants began making pilgrimages back to the islands. These were not easy journeys. St Kilda sits in some of the most dangerous waters in the world. The weather changes without warning. Seas can rise from calm to catastrophic in hours. Access requires a specialist boat and a rare window of fair weather, usually only available between May and September. But they went. In rare personal photographs and home movie footage from the 1950s and 1960s, we can see small groups of men and women standing in the ruins of the village, some of them visibly emotional, touching the walls of cottages where their families once lived. One woman, photographed in 1958, is standing in the doorway of what was once her grandmother's home. She is holding a piece of stone she has taken from the threshold. She will keep it for the rest of her life. Among these visits, one story stands out. In the early 1960s, a group of former islanders and their descendants organized a return trip to Hirta with the specific purpose of restoring one building, the village church. The church had been the heart of St Kilda's community for over a century. It was where children were baptized, where couples were married, where the dead were mourned. By the time the restoration group arrived, the building was in a desperate state. The roof was gone, the pews were rotted through. The bell tower, damaged in the 1918 bombardment, had finally collapsed entirely. The group spent weeks on the island, working in brutal conditions, rebuilding what they could. They did not restore the church to its original glory. That was impossible. But they stabilized it. They shored up the walls. They made it so that it would stand incomplete, open to the sky, but standing for at least another generation. This act of preservation was not forgotten. It drew attention from historians and conservationists across Britain, and it set the stage for what would come next. There are details in the history of St Kilda that most people have never encountered, facts so unusual, so quietly extraordinary, that they deserve to be told on their own. The first concerns the Soay sheep. When the islanders released their flock onto Soay in 1930, they created what is now one of the most important scientific resources in the world. These sheep have been breeding entirely in the wild, with no human intervention whatsoever for nearly a century. Scientists discovered in the 1960s that the Soay population offered an almost perfect natural laboratory for studying genetics, population dynamics, and evolutionary biology. Every single sheep on the island has been individually tracked and studied. Their births, their deaths, their breeding patterns, all of it meticulously recorded. In a remarkable twist of fate, animals that were simply left behind because there was no room on the evacuation boat became one of the most studied populations of any species on Earth. The second story concerns what happened to the graves. St Kilda had several burial grounds, including one adjacent to the village church on Hirta. These graves dated back generations. Some of the headstones marked families who had lived on the island for over 200 years. After the evacuation, nobody maintained the cemetery. The grass grew over the graves. The headstones began to lean and, in some cases, topple entirely under the force of Atlantic gales. Rain pooled in the depressions where coffins had once lain. Moss crept across the carved names, letter by letter, until entire identities became illegible. By the 1980s, several graves had become almost impossible to locate without careful surveying. It was only through painstaking archaeological work conducted in the 1990s and 2000s that researchers were able to map the full extent of the burial ground and identify the oldest graves still remaining. Some of those headstones, now almost completely buried in soil and vegetation, mark people who died on St Kilda in the 1700s. They have been waiting in silence for someone to find them again. The third story is perhaps the strangest of all. During the Second World War, the British military briefly considered using St Kilda as a radar station or signals outpost, given its position in the North Atlantic shipping lanes. The plan was ultimately abandoned. The islands were too remote, too exposed, and too difficult to supply. But the fact that the military even considered it reveals something important. St Kilda was not simply forgotten during the war. It was actively discussed in government offices in London. It remained, at least in strategic terms, a place that mattered. The empty village, the abandoned church, the wild sheep, None of it erased the islands from the map of British military thinking. Isolation, it turns out, does not make a place irrelevant. It simply makes it harder to watch. Today, St Kilda is one of the most protected and celebrated landscapes in Britain. In 1986, the archipelago was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site, one of only a handful of locations in the United Kingdom to hold that status. The designation was extended in 2005 to recognise not only the natural environment but also the cultural significance of the islands. St Kilda is now formally acknowledged as one of the most important sites in the history of human settlement in the British Isles. Access remains extraordinarily difficult. There is no permanent staff on the islands. There is no infrastructure, no accommodation, no electricity, and no fresh water supply beyond what can be collected from rainfall. Visitors, and there are very few each year, typically only a handful of organised expeditions, must arrive by boat from the mainland port of Leverburg on the Isle of Harris. The crossing takes several hours, and it can only be attempted in calm conditions. In a typical year, fewer than 200 people set foot on Hirta. Some years, when the weather turns savage for weeks at a stretch, the number drops to almost nothing at all. St Kilda does not welcome visitors easily. It never has. The North Atlantic does not forgive carelessness, and the islands sit exposed to some of the worst weather systems in the Northern Hemisphere. Every expedition is a negotiation with the sea, and the sea does not always agree. In footage shot by modern expedition teams, we can see the village of Hirta as it stands today. The stone walls of the cottages remain, most of them, though many have collapsed to waist height. The church still stands, its walls intact but its interior open to the sky. The school is a ruin. The storehouse is gone entirely, but the village is not disappearing. It is simply changing shape, slowly, year by year, becoming something new, a place that is neither human nor wild, but something in between. The Soe sheep still roam. Every summer, a small team of scientists travels to the island to continue the research that began over 60 years ago. The sheep population fluctuates, sometimes crashing in brutal winters, sometimes swelling in mild years, and every cycle teaches researchers something new about how life adapts, survives, and endures. The descendants of the original islanders still live on the Scottish mainland. Some of them have made the journey back to St Kilda multiple times. Others have never gone, but they carry the memory with them, in family photographs, in stories passed down through generations, in the small pieces of stone and driftwood that sit on mantelpieces in houses across Scotland. The last person known to have been born on St Kilda, a woman named Rachel Malcairns, passed away in 2016. With her death, the final direct link to a community that had existed on those islands for centuries came quietly to an end. St Kilda is empty now, as it has been for nearly 100 years. The wind still blows across the village street. The seabirds still nest in the ruins of the church. The sheep still roam the hillsides of Soe, completely wild, completely unaware that they are living proof of something remarkable. They are survivors, not because they fought for their place in the world, but because, on a single morning in August 1930, 36 people walked away from everything they had ever known and left them behind. The cottages will keep standing for a while yet. The graves will keep their silence, and St Kilda will keep doing what it has always done. It will wait, it will endure, and it will remember, in its own way, the people who once called it home and the long, strange, quiet story of what happened after they left.